What if some of today's greatest spiritual teachers were trying to solve the same human problems? Not necessarily arriving at the same conclusions and not teaching the same doctrines. Not asking people to join the same communities, but pointing towards something surprisingly similar. You're listening to The Occult and the Apocalypse, where we explore the hidden and the revealed through patterns, symbolism, and awareness. Not to predict, but to notice, and not to conclude, but to understand. Throughout history, people have offered many explanations for why certain spiritual ideas seem to reappear across cultures. Some point to cultural exchange, some point to shared human psychology. Others believe human beings are simply asking the same timeless questions about suffering, purpose, and the nature of reality. And still others embrace perspectives sometimes associated with ideas like omnism, the possibility that different traditions may each preserve part of a larger truth, describing the same deeper reality through different language and symbols. Whether any of those explanations are correct isn't the question we're exploring today. Instead, I'd like to do something much simpler. I'd like to place some of history's most influential spiritual teachers side by side and simply observe respectfully. Because something interesting begins to happen when we begin to look beneath the labels, beneath the denominations, beneath the institutions, beneath the centuries that separate them. Certain themes begin appearing again and again. Jesus walks into the wilderness before beginning his ministry. And long before anyone knew his name, Muhammad, peace be upon him, would leave the noise of Mecca and climb to a small cave on Mount Hira, where he spent many nights in contemplation. According to Islamic tradition, it was there that everything changed. A young prince named Siddhartha walked away from a palace in search of something that comfort could no longer provide. Lao Tzu, according to tradition, left civilization altogether and before disappearing beyond the frontier, paused long enough to leave behind the wisdom that became the Tao Te Ching. Among the Lakota, a person seeking vision would leave the community, entering solitude, fasting, praying, and waiting. Not simply to be alone, but to encounter something deeper. Different people, different cultures, different languages, different understandings of the divine. And yet, before any of them began teaching others, something happened first. There was a turning inward, an encounter, a transformation. And perhaps that's the first hidden pattern worth noticing. Because what if these traditions are not simply giving different answers? What if they're repeatedly inviting people into similar movements of transformation? Over the next few minutes, I'd like to explore 5 of those movements: solitude, surrender, humility, service, and connection. Not to argue that every tradition is the same, and not to flatten their differences, but to ask a question that I don't think we ask often enough. Why do spiritual traditions separated by geography, language, culture, and history keep inviting people to walk surprisingly similar paths? And maybe that's the first pattern worth exploring, because before Jesus preached, before Muhammad, peace be upon him, received revelation, before the Buddha awakened, before Lao Tzu left behind his teachings, something else happened first. They stepped away. Immediately after his baptism, before a single sermon had been preached, Jesus left the crowds behind and entered the wilderness. For 40 days he fasted, prayed, and faced temptation in the silence of the desert. Only afterward did his public ministry begin. Long before anyone recognized him as a prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him, regularly climbed Mount Hira, leaving behind the noise of Mecca to spend nights alone in contemplation inside a small cave. According to Islamic tradition, it was there that the first revelation arrived. Siddhartha, the prince who would later become the Buddha, walked away from a life of extraordinary comfort after encountering sickness, old age, and death. The answers he was searching for could no longer be found inside the palace. His journey began by leaving it. According to tradition, Lao Tzu became disillusioned with the world around him and departed civilization altogether. Before crossing the frontier for the last time, he was asked to record what he had learned, leaving behind the wisdom that became the Tao Te Ching. Among the Lakota, a practice known as Hambaleka was translated as crying for a vision, invited a person to leave the community for a time of fasting, prayer, and solitude in nature. Not simply to be alone, but to become attentive enough to receive guidance. Different stories, different centuries, different understandings of the sacred, and yet they all seem to begin with a remarkably similar movement. Not towards greater activity, towards stillness. Not towards more voices, but towards fewer. Which raises an interesting question. Why? Why do so many spiritual traditions begin by asking people to step away from the noise before stepping into their purpose? Perhaps because solitude was never really the point. Across these traditions, the goal didn't seem to be isolation. The goal seemed to be attention. Human beings repeatedly seemed to seek the sacred places that they did not build. In deserts, on mountains, inside caves, in forests, along rivers, in wilderness. Why? Perhaps because nature has a way of quieting the voices that constantly compete for our attention. Or perhaps because stepping away from the familiar allows us to notice what has been there all along. Whatever the reason, the pattern is difficult to ignore. Again and again, the encounter happens inwardly before it becomes outwardly expressed. The revelation comes before the teaching. The wilderness comes before the ministry. The cave comes before the community. The vision comes before the return. And maybe that's the first movement these traditions share. Not isolation for its own sake, but becoming attentive enough to hear something deeper. Because once attention changes, something else often changes with it. And maybe that's where the next pattern becomes even more interesting. Because once we become willing to loosen our grip, something else often begins to loosen as well. The way that we see ourselves. Across many spiritual traditions, humility is often misunderstood. People sometimes imagine humility as thinking less of yourself, as becoming smaller, less confident, less important. But when we look at the stories themselves, something quite different begins to emerge. Near the end of his ministry, Jesus kneels before his disciples and begins washing their feet. It was a task normally reserved for servants, and yet the teacher becomes the servant. Not because he has less authority, but because authority itself is being redefined and demonstrated. According to many accounts of his life, Muhammad, peace be upon him, mended his own clothes, helped with ordinary household work, and discouraged people from elevating him beyond what he believed was appropriate. Influence did not separate him from ordinary life. If anything, it seemed to draw him closer to it. The Buddha teaches that much of what we defend as a permanent self may be far less permanent than we imagine. Not because we have no value, but because our identities are often more fluid than we realize. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna repeatedly invites Arjuna to focus less on personal recognition and more on faithfully fulfilling his role, to emphasize shifts from status to participation. Lao Tzu repeatedly returns to the image of water. Water seeks the lowest place. It does not compete. It nourishes everything it touches. And over time, it shapes mountains. Among the Haudenosaunee, the Thanksgiving address begins not with the individual, but with gratitude for the earth, the waters, the plant, the animals, the winds, the stars, and the relationships that make life possible. The individual enters the story already connected to something much larger. Different traditions, different symbols, different language, and yet another remarkably similar movement begins to appear. Not toward becoming less valuable, but toward becoming less centered on ourselves, which raises another interesting question. Why do so many spiritual traditions suggest that wisdom begins when we stop placing ourselves at the center of the story? Perhaps because humility isn't really about becoming smaller. Perhaps it's about seeing more clearly, seeing ourselves in relation to other people, in relation to creation, in relation to the divine. Because once something larger becomes the center, everything else begins to find its proper place. And maybe that's why humility appears so consistently across spiritual traditions. Not because it diminishes the individual, but because it expands their perspective. And once our perspective changes, the way that we relate to everyone else begins to change as well. And perhaps that's where the next pattern begins to reveal itself. Because if solitude changes our attention, if surrender changes our posture, and if humility changes our perspective, then something else almost inevitably begins to change as well. The way that we relate to other people. Across traditions, spiritual growth rarely seems to end with the individual. Again and again, it flows outward. Jesus tells us the story of the Good Samaritan, where compassion comes not from the person everyone expected, but from the stranger who chose to stop. He heals, feeds, forgives, and repeatedly reminds his followers that love becomes visible through action. In Islam, caring for the poor, the orphan, the traveler, and the vulnerable becomes an expression of faith itself. Service is not separate from devotion. It becomes one of its clearest expressions. In the Buddhist tradition, the bodhisattva becomes one of the most powerful spiritual images. One who could leave suffering behind, yet chooses to remain, helping others awaken alongside them. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna calls Arjuna not to withdraw him from responsibility, but to faithfully fulfill his role in service to something greater than himself. Among many indigenous traditions, leadership is often measured not by how much a person possesses, but by how much they contribute to the well-being of the community. Generosity becomes a reflection of relationship rather than status. Saint Francis of Assisi prayed, "It is in giving that we receive." Different stories, different cultures, different understandings of the sacred, and yet another remarkably similar movement begins to appear. Not away from ourselves, but beyond ourselves. Which raises another interesting question. If spirituality is about inner transformation, why do so many traditions expect that transformation to eventually benefit someone beside the person who experienced it? Perhaps because service isn't simply about helping other people. Perhaps it begins with seeing them differently. Seeing that your life is not entirely separate from theirs. Seeing that their joy and suffering are not entirely disconnected from your own. Seeing yourself in others and others in yourself. Perhaps that's why service appears so consistently across spiritual traditions. Not simply an obligation, but as the natural expression of a heart that no longer experiences itself as completely separate. Because once the boundaries between me and you begin to soften, compassion no longer feels like a rule. It begins to feel like the most natural response in the world. And maybe that's where all of these movements have been quietly leading all along. And perhaps that's where the final pattern begins to reveal itself. Because if these traditions repeatedly invite us into solitude, into surrender, into humility, and into service, what are they ultimately pointing toward? Perhaps connection. Not simply connection with other people, but connection itself. Jesus speaks of abiding in God and loving God and neighbor so completely that the two become inseparable. The Islamic tradition begins with the oneness of God and repeatedly calls people into a life in conscious relationship with that oneness. The Buddha teaches interdependence, the recognition that nothing exists entirely by itself. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna invites Arjuna into union with the divine through faithful participation in his dharma. Lao Tzu describes living in harmony with the Tao, the deeper current that flows through all things. Among the Dine, the idea of Hozho speaks of living in beauty, balance, and right relationship with the world around us. Different language, different symbols, different understandings of ultimate reality, and yet another remarkably similar movement begins to appear. Not towards separation, towards relationship. Which raises one final question. Why do so many spiritual traditions, separated by geography, language, culture, and history, repeatedly invite people toward connection with something larger than themselves? Perhaps because the destination was never simply knowledge. Perhaps it was alignment. Alignment with the divine, alignment with reality, alignment with one another. Some people experience this as the presence of God. Others describe it as harmony with the Tao. Others speak of awakening, and others of right relationship. Others simply describe moments when the boundaries between themselves and the rest of life seems to soften in ways that are difficult to explain. Whether those experiences arise from psychology or from shared human experience or from a deeper spiritual reality is something that each person must decide for themselves. But the pattern is remarkably difficult to ignore. Again and again, across centuries, across civilizations, across traditions that often disagree with one another. Human beings keep returning to remarkably similar movements of transformation. Perhaps that doesn't tell us everything, but perhaps it tells us something. And maybe that's what the occult has always invited us to do, to look beneath the surface, to notice what has been hidden in plain sight. Not to erase our differences, but to recognize that beneath many of them, there may also be a shared invitation, an invitation to become more attentive, more receptive, less centered on ourselves, more compassionate, and perhaps more deeply connected to the divine, to one another, and to the mystery of being alive. Thank you for being here with me and helping me take the occult and the apocalypse and see it as just the hidden and the revealed. Come back next week. We're going to talk about the myth of the Golden Age. I'll see you there.